it was absolutely terrifying to interview my parents because we had never talked about these topics before. I'm going to own this because this is my story and this is who I am. And as difficult and as ugly it sometimes was, this is who I am and I can't deny it.
The third culture is what emerges at the intersection between your culture of origin and the other cultures by which you've been shaped. Beyond Asian is a place for stories of global nomads with Asian roots brought up in diversity. Together, we explore the interplay of our pasts with our presents and our relationships with the multiple cultures we move in. These are more than conversations about Asian identity. They're portraits of whole people, what keeps them up at night, what their hearts long for, and the impact they hope to have on their communities. I'm your host, Sen Jan, a third culture kid born in China, raised in Canada, and currently based in Berlin. This series is a first step towards making peace with my own Asian background, and it's my hope that other third culture Asians will hear themselves reflected in our stories. After so much unimaginable trauma from the Vietnam War, how does a young Dutch-Vietnamese woman begin healing the emotional rifts in her family? In episode 6, I'm speaking with Yennhi Lee and Orihana Calcines in the Netherlands about their documentary, The Scars of War, and how their third culture perspectives help them to find each other and embrace their identities as global citizens. Welcome to the Beyond Asian podcast to Yennhi Lee and Orihana Calcines today. So I'm speaking with the both of you today about your recently released documentary, The Scars of War, which is a very personal story about Yennhi, your family who comes from Vietnam and who immigrated to the Netherlands where you were born. And this is a documentary. It's a short documentary of about 27 minutes, and it covers your personal journey to getting to know your own family history better, to understand some of the things that have happened to your family, as well as what it's been like for you growing up in the Netherlands and starting to slowly see these pieces of history come together. And Orihana is your filmmaker, and Orihana is from Venezuela originally, and she and her family also immigrated to the Netherlands where you both met. So this is a really interesting intersection of very different cultures, but also meeting in this liminal third culture space where both of you have similar experiences despite your very different backgrounds. So I wanted to start first by asking you, Yennhi, a little bit about what the background of this documentary is, and maybe you can give a little bit of history first as to where things kind of got started for you and your family. So let's start maybe with the fall of Saigon, which is kind of what precipitated a lot of the things.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so it actually all started during World War II, when Japanese forces invaded Vietnam, and to fight off both Japanese occupiers and French colonial administration, Ho Chi Minh, who was a political person in Vietnam, he was inspired by Chinese and Soviet communism, and he formed the Viet Minh, also known as the League for Independence of Vietnam. And at one point, the Japanese withdrew, and the French left an emperor called Dao in control. And Ho Chi Minh saw an opportunity to seize control and took over Hanoi and declared it the Democratic Republic of Vietnam with Ho as a president. But the emperor that was left in the south claimed Saigon as its capital. And both sides wanted the same thing, a unified Vietnam. However, both of them had different interests, as the South really wanted to stay connected with the West, and the North was inspired by communism, so they didn't want that. So the Viet Minh, who once fought against the French and the Japanese, became the Viet Cong, and America started supporting the South because they were really scared that communism would take over. So the war started in 1954, and in 1975, America withdrew and kind of abandoned Vietnam, really. And that led to the fall of Saigon on the 30th of April, 1975.
Mm-hmm. And how did that precipitate things for your father and his family?
So my father and my mom, like they were living in Hue back then. And Hue is situated in the middle of Vietnam, so really on the border of North Vietnam and South Vietnam. So that area was bombed a lot. And my dad, he didn't want it to be a communist, so he had no option but to flee the country and go somewhere else.
What were they doing to the people who didn't want to be communists?
They were sent to camps, and basically they were these camps where they said that they would teach you to learn more about communism, but really it was just a concentration camp, and a lot of people died there and never came back from these camps. So my father really didn't have a choice but to leave and flee the communism that has took over the country.
So when the fall of Saigon happened, your father decided that he had to leave Vietnam.
Yeah, yeah.
I imagine that that was not an easy thing to do.
No, definitely not, because he grew up there and his mom and his brother were still living there and all of his friends were still living there, and he really didn't want to leave, but he really saw no other option, because he is also disabled and he was also scared that he would be forced to go into military, but he wasn't able to do that. So he was just really scared about what would happen to him if he would refuse.
And that process of trying to leave Vietnam, can you share a little bit about that part?
So my father told me that he tried to flee 3 times. The first time, he was supposed to go on a boat to Malaysia that would take him to Malaysia. And there was this person that would help him do that, but everything was done illegally, of course. So the person told him to give him money, and it was also quite a big amount of money. And they were like, okay, after you pay, you have to come to the beach. We will pick you up and we'll take you to Malaysia. So he tried to do that, but when he came to the beach, there was no one, and he basically got scammed, and he lost a lot of money. Yeah, and after that, he actually went to prison because the police found out that he was trying to flee. After he came back from prison, he tried again. And that time, he also got scammed again. And the third time he tried to flee, it was through the same person, but he went partly by boat. So he took a boat that was close to Cambodia. And then from Cambodia, there was a car to pick him up, and the car would take him to a refugee camp. So it was through different ways. And I think that was one of the reasons that it might have worked this time and not the other times.
And your father was in the Cambodian refugee camp for quite a while.
He was in a refugee camp for 18 months.
Wow.
Which actually I heard someone telling me the other day that some people are in refugee camps for 10 years. So I think that for 18 months, I still think it's a very, very long time, because also the circumstances in these camps are not that great. There isn't a lot of food. You don't know when people will be able to help you. You're just waiting there and living day by day, and really see, like, there's almost no light at the end of the tunnel, we could say.
And your father, he was in his mid-20s or so when that happened?
Yeah, he was 23 when all of this happened. And I'm turning 23 this year.
Wow. How does that make you feel?
I just can't believe it. I can't believe that at my age now, turning 23, that I have to flee the country because it's not safe, not knowing where you are going, and also moving to a completely different country where you don't know the language, you don't know the culture, and you lose everything. You lose everything. And it really, really saddens me to think about something like that. And that there are still people nowadays that have to go through something like this.
Yeah, when you take such a big risk, you don't know if, first of all, you're going to make it, and second of all, how long it's going to take, and if you're ever going to see your family back at home again. You have no idea what your future is. You've basically thrown yourself into the universe and you hope for the best.
And you hope for the best. Exactly. Yeah.
And quite fortunately, things turned out better for your father in some time. So can you talk a little bit about what ended up changing for him after the time he spent at the refugee camp?
Yeah, after 18 months, he was invited by the Netherlands to come over because the Netherlands was accepting some refugees at the time. And of course, the Vietnamese War was going on, so they knew that there were a lot of refugees. From there, my father went on an airplane, went to the Netherlands, and he arrived in an asylum center in Apeldoorn. And from there on, they will organize like a house for you. They will organize a job for you. So that's how my dad finally ended up in Marsden, where he's
Yeah.
still living with my mom and my sister.
You were born in the Netherlands some years later, and so you're Dutch and you grew up in the Netherlands. So you speak Dutch, you speak English, and you speak Vietnamese. And you've also had a really interesting growing up experience because when your family moved to the Netherlands, they moved beside the house of an older Dutch couple who became your Dutch grandparents, kind of your adopted Dutch grandparents, which is such an interesting, unique situation. What was that like to grow up with your Vietnamese parents and then your adopted Dutch grandparents next door?
Oh, it was so beautiful because my grandparents, like I think it's just so special already that I call them my grandparents because we're not blood related, but they really, really see me as their grandchild. It was also quite difficult because, like I grow up in a house where my dad really wants to maintain this Vietnamese culture. My mom was always a bit more flexible, but my dad really wanted to maintain this Vietnamese culture. Normally throughout the week, I would go to my grandparents because they were babysitting me 5 days a week, basically, from morning to the evening until my dad came home from work. And then my dad would pick me up. But they really raised me with Dutch norms and values. And they are very, very clashing. They are complete opposites. So that was really, it was also really difficult, but also I think really beautiful because I got to see two perspectives.
I'm so curious as to how this just came about. Because in the documentary, there's a picture of you as a baby, basically as an infant with your grandparents. So they started taking care of you very, very soon after you were born. How did that come to be?
So when my mom came to the Netherlands, she saw that we had these Dutch neighbors. So, as you are neighbors, you go to each other's house, you introduce yourselves. And my mom told my grandpa and my grandma that she would work a lot and my dad would also work a lot. Plus my dad is disabled. So for him, it was a little bit hard to take care of me alone. And then my grandma said, "Oh, like I wouldn't mind watching her, once or twice. I mean, I could do that." And that resulted in 10 years of taking care of me, really. And I was more at their place than I was at my own house. And even so, I was there from Monday to Friday, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then on Saturday, my mom and my dad were home. And then on Sunday, my grandparents would come over every Sunday to have a coffee in the morning and talk just about the week, about life. So they really, really became my grandparents. And what I find really beautiful is that at one point, my Vietnamese grandparents in Vietnam, from my mom's side, my grandpa was fluent in French, and he actually wrote a letter to my Dutch grandparents, thanking them so much for taking care of me, as they are not able to do it, but my Dutch grandparents were.
This is so touching. I can see, how there could be the potential that there's jealousy or envy, that you have these adoptive Dutch grandparents, but there wasn't. There was just gratitude that someone was there helping to fill in for them when they couldn't. You were mentioning, of course, the Dutch values and the Vietnamese values are sometimes in direct opposition with each other. What kinds of things were there friction about?
I think there was a lot of friction in that my parents, for example, they had extremely high expectations of me,
Mm-hmm.
and that put a lot of pressure on me. And I'm talking about high expectations in school. They always really pushed me to be the best or do even better and take extra classes. But they also really had high expectations of me when it came to beauty standards, for example. They could be very mean, and I feel like a lot of Vietnamese people, they are really closed off at some point, but saying things directly to your children about how they look
Mm-hmm.
is something that's very normal. And for me, that wasn't normal because no one would ever tell me these things. Like when I was at my grandparents' place, they just accepted me for who I am, despite of the pimples I might have had or that my